Hi, everyone. My name is Shelley Reed. Thank you so much for joining us for our Afternoon of AI session. We have a full lineup for you today. Um, I am the manager of the Legal Services National Technology Assistance Project. I am a middle-aged white woman. I wear glasses. I have shoulder-length brown hair, and I use the pronouns she, her. And I am going to kick it over to Christina, who has a great presentation for us, and I want to give her as much time as possible. If you have questions during the presentation, please put them in chat, and we can address them if necessary at the time, or we'll wait to the end for some that are not necessarily what she's talking about right now. All right,
Thanks,
over to you,
Shelley.
Christina.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I keep having to transition because it's 10 in the morning for me, but good afternoon to the rest of you who are in the East Coast. I'm going to be talking today about machine translation and how it's being used in legal settings primarily, obviously, and what to consider or watch out for when you're using these technologies. I'm an attorney. I started off in legal aid and then moved on to working in court-based self-help centers, all in California. And then for the last 10, 15 years on and off, I've been consulting on issues of language access and access to justice. I'm also a federally in California certified court interpreter in Spanish. I'm a native Spanish speaker. So you'll see that a lot of the examples that I bring up and that I walk you through are in Spanish. But I think it's fair to say that similar and obviously also likely different and more complex ones also come up in other languages. Let's get started, I guess. I'm sort of navigating two monitors that are not working very well with me, so hopefully they'll cooperate today. So first, just to make sure we're all on the same page, machine translation is the use of AI to automatically translate from one language into a target language without human involvement. Most of the translation software out there that most of us are using relies on neural machine translation networks, so NMT. It uses sort of like mimicking the brain, but like artificial neural networks to process and translate text by learning from extensive multilingual data sets, right? So it uses these networks to predict the likelihood of certain sequences of words. And then the output, the translation, is the product of the engine using those word sequences with the strongest connections as it has learned them and continues to learn, because it's sort of an ongoing process through ongoing training on these data sets. And also you probably have noticed if you've ever done a Google Translate search, you get the option of a thumbs down, thumbs up, thumbs down. If you give it a thumbs down, you also get to provide a suggested translation. So that's one of the ways in which these engines also learn. So it follows, right, that the performance of the machine translation, the NMT machine translation, depends on the quality of the data sets that it's using for training and the ongoing training by the users. Google Translate is probably what most of us have used. And the data shows, I was looking at different sort of research studies from Google and from other companies on the accuracy rates. Spanish is one of the highest, if not, well, Spanish, and I've heard anecdotally Portuguese, although I rarely see Portuguese in these studies, but Spanish is anywhere between 90 and 94%, depending on what study you're looking at. And it makes sense, right? Because if it depends on the quality of the data set and the amount of content, Spanish is going to have really high usage, also high training, but it does tend to struggle with languages that are less widely spoken or for which there isn't as much content online that it can draw from to work. Other high rated languages are Tagalog is really high. It's up in the 90 percentile. Korean and Chinese are often talked about as also being high, but they're 80, 81%, which is a pretty big drop considering, right? Between 94% to 80, 81%. Farsi, for example, is 67%, just to give you an idea of accuracy. And while they do well with general content, it also makes sense, right, that the more specialized you get, the higher the likelihood of mistranslation. So if the translation is going to depend on the connection between words, the likelihood and the prediction of the sequences with words and the strongest connections, it's going to favor the more common sequences of words and the more common usages of terminology, where there's more content to draw from and where there's been more training. So as you can imagine, then if you're using it in the legal setting, which is, much more limited, you're working with fewer words that connect differently from regular everyday speech, and also smaller data sets, less training, then you're going to be introducing a larger possibility of errors. I haven't seen, I'm not a researcher, I've looked, I haven't seen, and some of you may be aware, I haven't seen studies of these percentages, so this rating for languages in other contexts. I think like legal or medical, I've seen more articles about medical use of machine translation, but I don't have a sense, and I don't know if the studies have been done about whether or how NMT, Google Translate, let me just use that for shorthand, is performing in, for example, the legal setting. One of the dangers is that, and we'll talk about this more on the next slide, is that the machine translation can produce like a technically perfectly sounding translation, and it makes sense in one context. Like I said, it's natural sounding, but it's incorrect or inappropriate in the context that you're working in. And again, as I'll go into more detail, often neither side in that conversation or that interaction realizes that there's been a mistranslation. LLMs are probably the next step beyond neural machine translation. I'm going to talk a little bit about it at the end, but all of the work that I've done has been with NMT, and so that's where I have the most insight. With LLMs, I play with ChatGPT a fair amount to help me sometimes when I have to do translation review, and so I'll definitely share some thoughts on that at the end of the talk. You guys know as well as I do sort of the different ways in which all of us in this world are using machine translation and self-help settings or legal aid, attorneys' offices. Folks are using it to translate declarations and witness statements, translate court forms and pleadings, translating court websites. I think it's sort of become ubiquitous to see the Google Translate widget at the top of sites where you can then just pick a language from the dropdown. And then more and more it's being used in real-time interactions, sometimes combined with voice to text. And a lot of the examples that I'm going to bring up today come from my work in that field, where it's being used in courts and other settings, in interactions through an app with voice to text combined. So there's a transcription and a translation going on at the same time with NMT in the background. And of course, it can be cost effective, right? But hopefully I'll convince you by the end of this talk that it requires a human in the loop through this process. So I'm just going to go through these first 3 slides really quickly, because that's really what a lot of the examples are hopefully going to show you, is that it struggles with context. Sometimes you're presented with the option, for example, if you're working with Google, to feed it a glossary, which sounds like a good idea, but we'll talk about why in many ways it's not effective in the legal field. And of course, we'll also talk about how the quality of the input is critical to the output, right? Garbage in, garbage out. This sort of last bullet is what I was alluding to earlier in terms of what I find particularly dangerous about machine translation without human review. And it's that quite often, and I've seen it play out time and time again, is that neither side realizes that they haven't actually communicated. I've seen these conversations between a litigant and court staff, or whether it's a clerk's office or a self-help center, where they thought they're understanding each other, they thought they're having a communication, but they're actually having sort of this parallel conversation where they're not actually meeting. there's big chunks of critical information that are being left out, but neither side realizes that's happened. So for example, a lot of the conversations that I review are in the traffic context, that usually at traffic counters. And so some of the ways in which this plays out is that maybe someone doesn't get presented with all of their options to pay a traffic ticket because something about their inability to pay, for example, their challenges doesn't come through in that exchange. And so someone is just being told to pay the full price of a ticket and not realizing that there may be other options. Or someone doesn't understand that a point can be added for certain traffic offenses. A point can be added to their DMV or their driver's license record that then affects their insurance, and they have to pay higher costs that they could have prevented if the communication had gotten that across and they had signed up for traffic school, for example. Or they may not realize the ways or the options for contesting a traffic case. One of the more dramatic cases I've seen was with this woman. This is what she alleged when she went to the self-help center, is that her husband was abusive. He had abused her the day before. She ran to her neighbors to call the police. She's monolingual Spanish speaker. He's bilingual. He also called the police. And so she's relaying all this to the self-help center, that the police got to him first. And she claimed that he had scratched himself up to make it seem like she had abused him. Long story short, she's the one who gets arrested. What she also explains is she has a 4-month-old baby that she's breastfeeding, and that she gets arrested. They issue what in California is called an emergency protective order, which is a restraining order that the police issue after they talk to a judge on the phone. And those emergency protective orders are good for up to 7 days while someone has time to go to court. This emergency order kept her from her baby, kicked her out of the home, and obviously restrained her from him and from their other child. They had an older child. All of this stuff that I just shared with you, because of issues with both transcription and translation, doesn't really come through. What really comes through is that she has kids, that he's abusive. And so self-help just moves into helping her file her own restraining order, but nothing about the fact that she had been arrested, that she can't have access to her baby, that she doesn't have access to her home. None of that stuff comes through. And so she walks out of there thinking that her filing the restraining order is going to take care of everything, because she communicated everything she was supposed to communicate. Self-help thinks that they addressed all of her issues, because everything that came through to them, they addressed with the paperwork that they helped her with. And meanwhile, this entire set of facts that are critical to the recourse and the relief she should have gotten are missed in this exchange. And again, both sides were well-meaning. Both sides thought that they had exchanged all the information, because from their point of view, they had. It's just that the disconnect happened in the translation and neither side was aware of that. So let me start showing you some examples. Let's talk to you a little bit about context first. So any of you that speak Spanish probably can see some of the problem right away. But here, for example, with when is my due date, it got translated to when is my date to give birth? When is my due date to give birth? On the second one, how far do you want court? And these are all, I recreated these in Google Translate, but these are all real interactions, right? This is how folks really have talked to each other. And these are literally the way that messages that folks have sent through the translation. So court was translated as a basketball court or a sports court in this case. Essentially, the translation is how far do you want the basketball court to go? The DA charged you with a battery case. First, you probably are noticing the DA did not get translated because it's an acronym. But also, battery case was translated as a case of batteries or a container of batteries. And so literally the translation is the DA loaded you with a case of batteries. Over here in the corner, what type of trial, sorry, I was in the wrong, over here in the corner, what type of trial is this for? Trial was translated as a test. So again, you can see how, and it makes sense, right? If it's going to be going to general context and the strongest sequence of words that are out there in data set is going to be going to more generalized uses of terminology, which are not going to be appropriate in the legal context. And then you have the different sort of particularities of languages like syntax, grammar, things like that can also cause problems. So let me go through this example in Spanish. So in Spanish, to say, and you can kind of look at the translation, to say where you live or where he lives is translated exactly the same way. So it's only through context, or a human might, if a human was doing this translation, they would emphasize where you yourself live or where he lives and then emphasize he. So let's say, for example, in a small claims case here in California, you file your case where the defendant lives, right? If the output can be interpreted either way, a lay person receiving that message is going to interpret it the way that it makes sense for them, which for most people is going to be, I file where I live, because that's what makes sense to a non-legally trained person. And so while the clerk here was perfectly clear in their message about where this needed to be filed, the recipient of the message is interpreting the message in the way that makes the most sense to them if there's that room for interpretation. And the sender of the message, again, the clerk in this case, has no idea there was any ambiguity in the message because they were very clear in how they expressed it. I'll talk a little bit more about some of these examples. I was trying to figure out with colleagues how to get across the challenge with the possessive adjective su in Spanish. And it occurred to me that many of us know, just sort of from culture, that mi casa es su casa means my home, or my house is your home or your house. But actually, technically, it could also mean my house is his house, my house is her house, my house is their house. And a human interpreter or a bilingual person would be able to clarify who they're talking about when they say su in this situation, but the machine translation can't do that. So imagine, I've worked a lot in family law. So imagine when you're doing financial disclosures in a divorce and you're trying to break down who owns what property or what debt. In fact, you can see here in the corner, this is a question from a self-help attorney to a litigant. And the question is, did you get served with his property declarations? The way that it gets translated is vague. So it could mean exactly what was asked. Did you get served with his property declarations? Or it could also mean, did you serve him with your property declarations? And again, it's going to be the receiver who's going to interpret what the question really means. And in this particular case, and you can see when you go through the conversation, the litigant here was really concerned that she was following all the right steps, doing all the right things. So she's going to read this as, did I do something right? Or did I mess something up? So of course she read it as, did I serve him with my property declarations? And it's not until, 10, 15 minutes later that self-help staff realizes that she had answered the wrong question and not what was intended. I've seen this sort of really problematically work its way through when someone's helping someone fill out the financial disclosure forms. Again, they're all, property and debt, and you need to find out what's community property, what's separate property, and of that separate property, what belongs to one spouse versus the other. And the helper is asking all the right questions, being very specific in their questions, but you can tell the way that the respondent is answering, that she's answering what she, so there's two things going on. One is the answer could be the translation could be vague for the receiver. So then they're interpreting it in the way that makes sense to them, which may or may not be accurate. Or because it's vague, the app doesn't know, so it guesses. And so it'll guess as to who the question is about and whose property you're asking about. So I saw this whole interaction around filling out a community and separate property declaration, where you can tell that the wife was answering the wrong. She was answering about what he owned and not what she owned. And when the questions were about what they owned together, she was still answering about what he owned. Super dangerous is that these forms, that she's then given these forms, they're signed under penalty of perjury and they're filed. And these forms, there's huge penalties for lying on these forms, down from like either sanctions or even losing the right to these assets. And meanwhile, no one here was lying, right? She did the best she could given the information she was getting, and the helper didn't realize this was going on the other side. It also struggles, and again, back to the theme, right? If it's going to be using sort of more general terminology, it's going to struggle with legal terminology. So for example, and I did a reverse translation here so you see the problem. You have a warrant is translated as you have a court order. A court order could be anything. A court order could be a payment plan. A court order could be, your divorce. A court order could be, millions of different things. So it certainly doesn't convey the seriousness of a warrant. And in the context in which I review these conversations, again, a lot of it can be traffic. A warrant is always an arrest warrant, but the clerk never says, I've been doing this for a couple of years and I have yet to see a clerk call it an arrest warrant. They just call it a warrant. It's shorthand for them. And so all that's coming through is you have a court order. So we know that that's a problem. Here's another one. Let's put the word violation aside for a minute. It's very common to hear a clerk or someone in traffic saying this particular traffic violation carries no point, meaning it doesn't get reported to the DMV. It's not going to affect your insurance, et cetera, et cetera. But no point in the general context means that, right? Something has no point, or it could mean it makes no sense, which is in fact how it was translated, is this violation makes no sense. Then violation presents a whole other host of issues, because in Spanish, it's, it can mean an infraction or a violation in the way that we mean it, but it can also mean rape. I mean, technically in English too, but in English, we rarely use violation for rape, whereas in Spanish, it's very common. It's sort of the most common way that you would refer to a rape. So a human translator would have known to use a different term for violation and would have understood that the point here, what it means, and would have translated it appropriately. It also has some biases in the translation. So for example, Spanish always defaults to the masculine. And so the first example, me maltrata, which is essentially someone abuses me. It doesn't specify who or gender. Google Translate will almost always default to he mistreats me. The middle example is Hungarian, which I don't speak, but I attended this just really fascinating webinar that they did at the university, the Autonomous University of Mexico, on AI and the preservation of language. I mean, they were all linguists and they were just talking about languages with lesser diffusion and how AI may impact the preservation of these languages. But they brought up this same issue of biases, right? And so the original Hungarian also doesn't have gender implied in it. And so the machine translation inserted gender. So he is investigating, she is raising a child. I tried to recreate this in Spanish. And so, you can see that last example is similar. So the politician is a woman. The way that the politician is translated is as in the masculine. So sort of very literally is the male politician is a woman. And then for the nurse is wrong, nurse was translated in the feminine. So you can see where the app is just guessing, right? If it can't tell from the original language who's doing what and what the gender of the agent in the conversation, it's going to guess. I've seen this come up as a problem a lot in restraining order cases, especially Here we have a type of restraining order called civil harassment, which can involve neighbors and a lot of people or workplaces, things like that. And there's a lot of people involved. And so if the gender keeps getting changed, and again, like it doesn't actually even keep gender within the same message. So you might say, she hit me, she did XYZ, and that second she in Spanish gets left out because of how Spanish works. The app may very well, the Google Translate may very well say, she hit me, and then he did XYZ. And so you can tell as a helper, it's going to be really confusing for you to track who's doing what and anything that involves sort of agency. One of the solutions that was offered, and one of the projects that I work in through Google was, well, you can feed it your own glossary. And as an agency, the agency that I was doing this work for had this extensive glossary, and we're like, great, this will take care of the issue of the due date and a lot of these issues where it's using terminology from a general context and not the legal context. This worked well for the due date example, for example, because most of the time in the legal context, the due date is going to be the due date to do something. It's unless you're dealing with a parentage case where someone is trying to establish parentage of an unborn child, and you might ask about a due date. Almost always it's going to be the due date to take an action. So it worked well. It also worked well with warrant, right? Because in our particular context, it's always going to be an arrest warrant. So we trained it to always translate warrant to arrest warrant. But it sort of broke down after that. And the reason why is because we are often moving in both contexts. Sometimes we use a term in the legal context and sometimes we don't. Let me use the address example as probably the easiest one to describe. So, and this is not even so much legal context, but just context that's important for you. So we noticed that it was translating address as home address. And because these are often used in restraining orders and paperwork like that, we wanted it to have a more neutral translation for address, just an address, whether it's mailing or not, just a more general address that didn't imply that you had to provide your home address. So we fed it as a glossary term, this more generic term for address. But then all of a sudden we started realizing that when the clerk said, what issues do you want to address? What do you want the judge to address? The judge addressed these issues. It was inserting mailing address for address because it doesn't think, right? So it just works as a find replace. It just grabs the word that you told it and it puts it where it sees it again, but it doesn't think at all in terms of like, is this the proper context for this new definition? Or, if you're using that find replace into Spanish, which conjugates verbs differently, has different articles preceding the word or whatever, it doesn't adjust. So you would get these grammatically incorrect messages that weren't adjusting. One of the silliest examples that hadn't occurred to us, but we fed the legal term in Spanish for will because we wanted to make sure that it was going to be consistently used throughout the translation. And then anytime somebody used the word will as I will show you this, I will show you that, it was inserting the Spanish word for a probate will. So we ended up having to pretty much undo everything except for due date and warrant because it was leading to many more problems than it was solving. One of the things that is successful is this auto machine learning idea. So if you contract with Google, you can build your own model and create your own data set. And then it can be a lot more effective. It's a user-defined translation model, which allows you, the agency, to train the Google Translate engine with your own bilingual data. It's getting deprecated in September, but it's getting replaced with another Google platform that apparently does the same thing and then has some enhanced functionality as well. It works a lot better because you're feeding it. So let me kind of tell you how it works. So you have to, in order for it to work better and to build this data set, Google recommends that you do anywhere between 5 to 10,000 language pairs, English, Spanish phrases, which is a lot. One of the ways you can do that, and one of the agencies that I worked for did that, is by scrubbing its website, which had been professionally translated from English to Spanish, and grabbing, over 6 or 7,000 pairs from that. I then reviewed to make sure that the data had been extracted correctly, fixed whatever needed to be fixed, and then that gets fed into the model. And then you ask the model to do translations for you and see how it goes. And like I said, because you're giving it your own data, you're going to get much better results. The problem it has, there's a couple of issues. One is definitely, as you can imagine, it's resource intensive, right? You need someone, a language, you need the developers, IT folks to do all the stuff on the back end, which I don't even understand. And then you need a language expert that's doing all of the review. And these are a lot of language pairs. And then, of course, after you feed it and you train it, then you have to review it again, make sure it did it correctly. If it didn't, you fix it. So it's this iterative process to get it to where you want it to get. The thing that you can do, which is, well, I have two ideas in my head at the same time. So let me do the first one, which is, we didn't realize this at first, but you have to be incredibly careful with the data that you're feeding it. Because one of the things we started finding is, so in the example of fill out this form, then file it in downstairs at the clerk's office, that file it was getting translated as a complaint. File it as a complaint. And we're like, where is it getting this? Is it hallucinating? Because we hear that word about AI all the time. Is it hallucinating? And I would feed regular Google Translate that exact same sentence, and regular Google Translate had no issue. It would treat the it as an it in Spanish. So we couldn't understand why I was doing this. And then we realized that the data we had been feeding it from our website was saying, file this petition at your clerk's office. And so it had learned that the most common sequence of words after file is the petition or the complaint. And that's how I was training. So we had to essentially then train it to forget that we had taught it that, and train it with file the document, file it, file, with a lot of new phrases that took petition out of the equation, so that it would learn that's not always a sequence that goes through. And this is, again, I was saying, it's an iterative process. You just keep going with it, because, one of the things we realized after a while is that it was translating do by as do before, which for a lot of lay people may not make a difference, but, we work on deadlines all the time. So we understand that extra day can make a big difference, and it's important that people get the right legal information. So we put together about 100 to 200 new phrases where we taught it to do by in the way that we wanted it to, and fed it. And then, it produced translations. We corrected it again, fed it again, and it now is doing that do by accurately. But so it's an ongoing process, but the quality of the translation and the accuracy is a lot better. It still struggles with context, so it still won't keep for example, if you've just been talking about your wife, it won't remember that it's a she. It'll switch to he quite easily the next time, or to they, or something. So it can't keep context. And of course, there's still issues with the nuances, right? Linguistic or cultural nuances. I see there's a question in the chat. Let me see.
I think it is relevant to
Yeah.
what you're talking. So the question is this prep work for building a model really faster and more efficient than just simply having a human translate work on completing the actual translation without any machine involvement?
Right. I think if you're, it's a great question. So if you're translating something static, like a document or a website, I would say no. It's much easier to just pay a professional translator. If you're trying to build, which is this project, a real-time, real-life, essentially it's an app. California calls theirs the court translator app, but I know other courts are exploring the same technology, where you don't have a human translator, you're using it in the moment, and no one's coming to review it until after the interaction has happened. For those real-time interactions, you're trying to have the best accuracy possible. So that's where this comes in, right? Is you're trying to train your app for that real-time. I just got to notice that my internet connection is unstable, so hopefully I haven't lost you guys.
No, you're fine.
Okay. I'm in the country, so I have really bad internet. So if you're trying to just use it in real time where you're not going to have a human present, which, you know, I have some thoughts about that, but if that's where you're going, then your goal is to make the app and the translation as accurate as possible. Then that's why you would invest in this kind of effort. Because, I mean, I'll tell you, for this one particular project, the accuracy in Spanish translations before AutoML was launched was about 65%, which is very low, especially when we're talking about people's legal rights, et cetera. And it's now been, after a year of consistent training and everything, it's now at 80%, but actually better. It's because we tag them for major error versus minor error. Minor doesn't impact communication. It's still an error that we want to address, but it doesn't impact the actual communication. It doesn't distort the message. So actually the major errors are now only 10%. So it has an accuracy of 90% if we also count in minor errors. So 80% no errors, 10% more minor errors. And so you get to about 90% where you at least are able to have good communication. If I haven't answered your question, feel free to jump back in, but hopefully that helps. Here's the other issue that I brought up earlier about garbage in, garbage out, right? So the source message is critical. So if you're helping, let's say that you're helping somebody translate a declaration, and you're having them write it in their native language to then put it in to the Google Translate to get it in English so that you can file it. This is how critical the source message is. This is just a comma. And a comma can take you from I'm not guilty to I'm guilty. And you can imagine if you're then bringing in transcription into this, we'll talk more about that briefly, but it can really lead to some serious issues. Here's another similar example. This, again, very typical in the traffic context. I'm not trying to, so if you got a correctable violation because you didn't have a driver's license, if you can correct, were you referring to recently? No, that's a different, if you Google or if you chat GPT what's happening to Google AutoML, it'll tell you. In fact, I just did that. It'll tell you exactly. It's going to a Google API. It's unrelated to Gemini 2.0, I think. Again, I'm not you guys are probably more brushed up on technology than I am, but I don't think it's related. So with a correctable violation, if you can provide proof of your that you've gotten a driver's license, yeah, Vertex AI, exactly. Thank you, Shelley. If you can provide proof of your driver's license, your ticket goes from over $500 to $25 because it becomes a fix-it ticket that you can correct. Here, this is what I was telling you earlier. If the translation's not right, it's going to affect somebody's relief or recourse, right? So here, what someone actually said is, I'm trying to get my license again, but because the comma got left out, they're essentially, what comes through is, I'm not trying to get my license. So the clerk moved on to just giving them the full citation with the full amount, instead of giving them the options for a correctable violation. Here's an example that an advocate shared with me, and this is a litigant. You can kind of tell which messages were sent by staff versus the litigant, but this gentleman made a lot of typos. A human can easily decipher them because he essentially wrote phonetically. and failed to separate some of these words. So this should be an S, and these should be two different words, etc. And like I said, a human, a bilingual staff person would have easily figured this out. But as you can see, it ends up making no sense whatsoever. In English, I put the actual translation of what he says right next to the utterance for you. You can also see the example that I brought up where he talks about my wife in the first message, but down here, it gets changed to he left for 3 days. Also here, essentially, this is a family who came to the United States and got political asylum because they were in danger in Mexico. He's saying here that they're in Mexico, they're in danger, but the way that it comes through is so vague that it makes it seem like they're in danger here. And that's why she or he is taking them to Mexico. And then here in this last message, you can see he's saying she wants to take them there. And again, he just kind of blends two words together and misspells them slightly, but it's very easy to tell if you speak Spanish what this means. But instead it becomes a country or a town that I've never heard of, right? She wants to take them there. I mean, she wants to take them to para allá, wherever that may be. So you can see how the source message is critical, and if there's any errors in it whatsoever that the machine can't decipher, then you can miss some pretty major facts. Okay, so this is sort of the project that I've been kind of alluding to here, is machine translation and real-time interactions, right? And then you often have two pieces. There's the voice-to-text piece and the translation piece. The voice-to-text piece brings in the transcription issues that I've been alluding to. I know when I text, I use voice to text to text, and I dictate the punctuation in my text messages. But most of these folks, and when I walk through courthouses or when I see people out in the wild using these translation, Pocket Talk or all these different translation apps on their phone, they're not inserting translation. So the app is guessing as to where the punctuation goes, which, as we just saw, can create a big issue. Another example, for example, in Spanish, sí with an accent on the I means yes. Sí without the accent means if. There's a huge difference between yes and if. And if the app doesn't catch it, which the transcription doesn't catch it, which I see all of the time, then you have a completely different message, because it also is going to structure the sentence very differently. The big issue, which I was alluding to earlier, is that because it's a real-time interaction, there is no human review in the moment. So neither side knows that there is a problem. Guidance, which sometimes is use it for simple interactions. All of us who have ever worked with a litigant know that something can start simply and very quickly turn complex. And sometimes it's hard to know when that has happened. And also even simple messages can be mistranslated. So it's really hard to sort of give really good guidance around how to use this, other than, these best practices about how to send messages. What I mean by user characteristics can affect the performance is that, then you can have someone who's a quiet speaker, who sometimes their words aren't going to get picked up by the voice to text, who pauses a lot, where the app is going to insert a comma or a period when there wasn't supposed to be. And we've seen what effect that can have. Someone who speaks really fast or blends words into each other, which in Spanish is very easy to do because of the how the article and the next word, if the article ends, for example, in A and the next word starts with A, it just get blended and then it becomes a totally different word. And in California, for example, in Central California, we have a really high indigenous population from Latin America or Mexico, and Spanish for them is not their native language. And they use, when they speak Spanish, which is what they use to communicate, because very few people speak these other languages, they use very different or off syntax and grammar in their statements. And so a human can, again, pick through it, but the machine can't. And so it really makes, for example, I mean, this is the sort of the easiest one to, but it's easy to explain, is many say el corte for the court instead of what it should be, which is la corte. El corte means the cut. So I keep seeing translations of I missed my haircutting appointment. I missed the cut when they're really talking about court. And so, you know, there's all these things that the English speaker on the other side may not realize are going on. And it's not until someone reviews it that you can see where the miscommunication happened. Here's a mistranscribed message. All that got left out was a question mark. And the message went from, I mean, I don't love this translation. Technically, what this person asked is, would it behoove me to go to traffic school? But at least here, if it picks the question mark, then the clerk at least knows that there's a question here. But because it didn't, the statement essentially is, it's not convenient for me to go to traffic school. This person then doesn't get signed up for traffic school, which means they get a point on their record and higher insurance rates for 3 years, right? So you can see how it just really affects the recourse and the outcome for folks. Just something as simple as a question mark. Let's talk a little bit about LLMs. As I said earlier, I don't have a lot of experience with them other than my own playing with it. But in my work, it's all been NMT. But LLMs can much better understand nuance and context in some ways, cultural references and domain-specific terminology. And of course, you can use prompts to describe the parameters for the app. So I will often, because I'm from Spain, but the population in California is largely from Mexico. So I will ask ChatGPT what are preferred terms or more common terms in Mexico, use plain language, all these kinds of things, right? So you can really control for a lot more with the LLM. And it does do a much better job at keeping context, right? If you just talked about your wife, it'll continue to refer to this person as she. It won't all of a sudden in the very next sentence bring in he. Let's see. One of the things that I tried last night just for kicks is I put in translate warrant for me. And it asked me, well, there are different types of warrants. What kind of warrant do you want? There's this one, and this is a translation. There's this one, which is something that Google doesn't do. So I said, what would Google Translate tell me a warrant is? And it said, well, Google will tell you it's a court order. But that's technically correct, but it's vague. And it went through the whole explanation about why it's vague or whatever. And I'm like, well done, right? So these are the ways in which LLMs, I think, are going to be sort of hopefully the future of machine translation, because they're much more able to do this. But, you know, they still have some issues. First, you know, you need large data sets. So, of course, languages of lesser diffusion are still going to be a problem. I was able to recreate the same sort of bias issues around agency and defaulting to he, although interestingly, so a couple of weeks ago, I had to do the I am abused, and it did he abused me. When I did it last night, it gave me he, she abused me. So it is learning, right? That you need to then ask follow-ups. And maybe that's something that you can train these with prompts. It's like, ask me the questions about what's vague in what I just fed you so that we can perfect the original text before you translate it. One of the things that was interesting, and then is that, and I've seen this, it just sometimes makes up stuff that I didn't tell it in the translation. And I saw this example on Blue Sky recently. So I'll give you a moment to look at it. But essentially, this person gave ChatGPT a document to translate in Chinese. He got it back, and he ended up having a colleague look at this document, and the document it made no sense. It was not at all what he had given it. And he asked ChatGPT what had happened, and you can see here what ChatGPT did is essentially, I just wanted to make you happy. I wanted to be helpful. And so based on the file name you gave me, I made up what the content was. You know, the document wasn't extractable. There was no text there for me to work with. So I just made some stuff up. So this is the stuff that, unless, you know, it's like, as this guy says in his edit is, you know, I mean, in his lesson, always verify. It's like, you can't trust it because it might do these prediction things based on what it thinks you want to hear or what it thinks you just gave it, and not actually be accurate at all. Hopefully I've convinced you that we really need a human in the loop. If not, I've definitely failed. But it definitely can be cost effective, right? I mean, one of my hats is that I review the professional translation of court forms and the self-help website for the California courts. And I have noticed over the last couple of years that even professional translators are often starting with AI as the first run through, right? It's cost effective. And then they go through and clean up the text. And then there's a QA process behind that cleans it up too. Potentially, if you have well-trained bilingual staff, you could run something through AI and then have that bilingual staff person review it. The caveat, of course, the warning I always say is just because someone's bilingual doesn't mean that they can translate. And there are nuances in language that can be easily missed, even by the most bilingual people. But trained staff who are used to working in language and these other languages, in some ways can also really add a lot to the professional translation, because even professional translators may miss nuances. For example, I have seen professional translators translate do by as do before, or translate for the service of process, they have to be 18 or older as they have to be over 18. Little minor things, not minor, little things like that get missed by a non-legal professional that would immediately get caught by someone in our offices, right, who works on these cases all the time. Ideally, a best practice, which of course assumes resources, but is that you would have a professional translator, and then you have a legal reviewer, which is my role for California, that reviews the translation from a legal lens, but also can help you keep the register. So, you know, tip number one is whenever you do translation, I mean, tip number one for any content, right, is plain language. But then it's important, very important also, if you're going to do translation, to use plain language. So a lot of times professional translators will increase the register of a translation, and your legal reviewer can help keep the plain language. Just indulge me for a minute. This is a little bit on the linguist side, but I do want to talk a little bit about AI and its potential effect on language and culture, and especially when you're contemplating using machine translation for educational materials, web information, PSAs. So when the AI doesn't find a translation in a particular language, it's going to default to the patterns of the dominant language, which are going to be, it's going to be usually English, which makes the language sound less natural to speakers of that language, which in itself can create barriers to acceptance of the materials that you're trying to share. And since humans can't keep up internet content fast enough, content creation fast enough for AI, right, at some point, probably already has happened, AI is learning from itself. It's not just reproducing any errors, but you're also duplicating any kind of language patterns that get further and further away from the actual language, and certainly from the richness of language. And you get away from words that are very intimately tied to culture. And you're probably like, Christina, like, we're just trying to get somebody help. We're just trying to just like get somebody out the door here with the right pleadings, or understanding what their legal options are, or how to pay their ticket. And sure enough, you know, that's fair. But I think many times we're trying to build trust with the communities that we serve, with the clients that we help. We want to provide an environment of dignity and respect. And so in those situations, I would argue that it really does matter. Again, if you're just trying to get somebody to the right place, the payment plan, the right court forms, fair. But when you're trying to create or foster relationships with the various populations that you serve, when you're translating educational materials, again, or when you're doing know your rights clinics, things like that, then I think that translating through AI alone isn't doing that. A couple of days ago, I asked ChatGPT what it thought about its ability to be culturally responsive versus a human when it's translating, and it gave me a bunch of different terms. I'm about to show you, and I asked it to tell me how, using any of those terms that it had fed to me, it felt like AI was different from human translation. Here, this is a screenshot of what it told me. Now I'll just give you a minute to read through it. So contrary to everything I've just said for the last hour, I'm going to actually let ChatGPT have the last word here and leave it here. But I know I went a little longer than I was hoping to, but we have a little bit of time for questions. And let me just stop sharing.
We do have a question in the chat, and the question is, if one is considering using a third-party vendor that uses generative AI to perform translation with a human in the loop, what are the most important questions that you would ask them?
That's a great question. First, I think it's critical that you have an agency glossary for your terms, for your preferred, not just for like legal terminology, but also your preferred terms. So for example, a long time ago, many interpreters really dislike this, but California decided that for court, instead of translating it as tribunal, which is the formal word for plain language purposes, it was going to translate it to corte. And so that's something, those are, and domestic violence is translated a specific way. So you want to give them a clear glossary, but also California created a style guide, which tells them how you want, plain language and keeping register, even with choices for, or examples of what that means, how you want links to be handled, whether you want folks to be told that they're going to an English only link, for example, in parens after the link. A lot of this information that will control as best as possible the output, and then build in the review. If you're going to have someone review it on your end, that they'll give you a second pass at the content for free as part of the quote, right? Because if you find that they're not following your glossary, which happens all the time, your glossary, your style guide, you want to be able to go back to them and say, you have to correct all of these things. So I think that those are the two biggest keys: is follow glossary, follow a style guide, and then find out what their human in the loop process really is, right? Like, how many layers are happening here? Who's doing it? Do you have a team of translators dedicated to me and to this content? Because one of the things I noticed is, let's say you send the translators 10 different domestic violence forms. If they assign those to 10 different translators, each form is going to have a very different style. And it's critical that you have consistent terminology and approach to any translation, so that a litigant isn't getting a petition for a restraining order that uses one word for a restraining order, and the order that the judge signs that has a different terminology for that restraining order. So talking about teams of translators, how they keep the translation memories updated, etc. Anything else? I think we're at the time, so you probably want to switch gears to the next presenter.
Well, thank you so much, Christina. This has certainly been a topic that is a hot button topic every time it comes up in our listserv. And you've given us some really great things to think about, and really important things. We have a comment in the chat that this was an excellent summary of the pitfalls that can be experienced with AI, that most people are unaware of because they assume AI can do everything really well.
Yes.
And Charles thinks that AI is considerably overhyped. So, but thank you so much. This has been
My
really
pleasure.
great. I think if people paid attention, those examples that you gave will like stop any arguments over whether or not human review is necessary.
Yeah.
Very, very clear. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here.